Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gerald Mills. I'm a geographer. I'm a physical geographer, and I study the climate of cities and have done so for about the last 30 years or so. I'm based in University College Dublin. So thank you very much to the Edge for asking me to talk here today. This is my opening slide. It shows essentially a dream, which is that we could just convert the entire urban space in one massive indoor space by putting a dome over the entire thing and controlling the climate. Now, to some extent, of course, that's exactly what does happen in cities, and each individual building looks after itself, often to the detriment of the outside spaces and other buildings. The title for this was about critical urban infrastructure, and the infrastructure here has almost been taken as knowledge infrastructure, and the idea is that no single profession, expertise, knows sufficiently about the urban environment to offer all the answers. And that ultimately there are gaps between the different groups. Sometimes they don't even share the same language, and it makes it very, very difficult to come up with some sort of comprehensive understanding of the urban system and how to change it for the better. Urbanisation is profound. It changes absolutely everything about the urban environment. It changes the atmosphere. We've already heard talk about the urban heat island, but it also changes completely the hydrology of the system. And to some extent, you'll see a lot of the solutions that people offer for solving issues about the urban hydrology are identical to the ones for solving the urban climate problems. It also changes utterly the urban biosphere. And if you look at all the policies for most cities around the planet, every one of them talks about green and blue infrastructure in order to reconstruct biospheres, in order to make the urban atmosphere cleaner and more pleasant, in order to sort out the urban hydrosphere. I'm going to focus on the climate. What causes the distinctive urban climate? Fundamentally, it's two things. It's what I describe as the form of the city, the fact that the landscape has been completely paved over. And paving it over means, obviously, the hydrology is completely affected. It also means that all capacity for evaporation in the system is greatly reduced, because you've simply cut off connections between the underlying soil and the overlying atmosphere. It also refers to the types of materials we use. Most of the materials we use have very, very distinctive properties, thermal properties, radiative properties. And here's the thing about urban systems that people forget: they're consistent because they shed water. The reason why the urban climate is distinct from the rural climate is not necessarily because the urban is peculiar, it's because the rural environment just changes properties with the seasons, rainfall events, etc. The urban environment is actually remarkably consistent. The major drivers in the urban systems are largely associated with the day patterns of going to work, turning on lights, moving from place to place. The third aspect is the geometry. Now, this is a very interesting aspect because in lots of urban climate models, the geometry is irrelevant. But in fact, the geometry is what controls access to the wind, access to sunshine, and access to the sky. Because fundamentally, the urban climate system is driven by things like cooling and heating. So the heating happens during the daytime. It turns out the urban system heats differently, and it cools at nighttime, and it cools differently. And a big part of the reason why it cools differently is because of the geometry. So that's the form. The function is the metabolism of the city, what it takes to keep it running. This is one of my favourite pictures. It's an alley in Singapore. It's completely urban. There's not a blade of grass anywhere. The buildings on either side are effectively refrigerators. You can see the refrigeration units on the other side of it. They maintain an interior climate, but they do so by pumping out the warm air associated with that and the vapour into the intervening environment. That's urban. So each of them in turn. Land cover. This is probably the best way of knowing about the strength of the urban heat island, is simply to know what proportion of landscape is paved and what proportion is vegetated. The more green area there is, the lower the urban heat island. It's that simple. So increasing vegetation lowers the urban heat island in terms of the surface temperatures. So that's a little patch of grass that is near us here. You can see that it's green, but actually doesn't have a great deal of functionality because it covers an underground car park. So by the time the summer goes on, the vegetation ceases to do any work, effectively turns it into a desert. This is the fabric. You can see the fabric is sort of the interesting part of the system. It connects the indoor and the outdoor. So the fight of the indoor is to create a comfortable climate. And you do that by essentially sealing yourself from the outside world, certainly in these climates here. So there you see old-fashioned stone houses, brick houses, heated internally obviously by fires, versus a modern building which actually doesn't want sunshine. You can see it actually puts up a set of blinds outside it to keep the sunshine out. It wants the light, doesn't want the sunshine. And here's the geometry. London is a very, very peculiar geometry because you often end up with what look to me like medieval streets, but the buildings on either side certainly aren't medieval, so you end up with these behemoths inserted inside very, very low individual buildings. So the geometry affects the circulation of air inside the streets, and if these streets have cars in it, it affects just how bad the air quality is. It affects the exchange of energy between the sky outside, the sunshine, and the individual street itself. Then there's the function. I haven't shown cars, which is a big part of the function here, but on the left-hand side is a typical residential street. Clearly somebody's chosen a referendum. They simply come outdoor to sit in the sunshine. That's what humans do. On the right-hand side, a massive block building with a very, very peculiar outer sheath on it, designed to protect the inner building itself, which has an enormous internal source of energy that it must dispose of simply to operate. Now, I've said urban. Remember, there's all sorts of urban. Knowledge exchange is good, but I think you need to know a great deal about the type of urban landscape you're in order to make the right sort of decisions. That's Tokyo on the left-hand side. Now that is urban, completely urban. It's an extremely rough surface. Its climate is completely different from the climate outside the city. On the right-hand side is suburban Chicago. We often think of Chicago as the home of the high-rise. Much of Chicago looks like this. When those trees are fully grown, they basically are bigger than the individual buildings. For all intents and purposes, you're looking at an environment that has a moderate urban impact, a lot of it hiding underneath the ground level, but from space you probably see nothing but vegetation. The one on the left-hand side is what we might regard as compact. This one is what you might regard as sprawl. Interesting, in terms of local impact, the one on the right-hand side probably is a very, very small local impact, very, very small urban heat island. It's just that to accommodate the number of people, the expanse of land for the right-hand side is immense, whereas the expanse of land for the left-hand one, the compact one we're supposed to gravitate toward, is a lot smaller. You have to know about the climate you're in. I don't care what anybody tells me about the urban climate, but the first thing you start out is, what's the climate to begin with? Because the urban climate can only affect what you start with. Here is the distribution of population around the world according to different climates. The climates we occupy tend to be very, very moderate. These are what Köppen would classify as sea climates. They're seasonal, but they're not radically seasonal. They get a bit of rainfall either in summer, winter, or even throughout the year, but they're not bitterly cold. The interesting climates in the future are going to be those red climates. These are the A climates, the tropical climates. They fundamentally have a problem of heating. If they choose a route which is cooling through air conditioning systems, then I think we can forget it as a population, because the amount of energy that's needed to bring down some of those buildings to the temperature that we would regard as coming from the Western world is immense. Notice, by the way, there's practically nobody living in those yellow climates, which are the dry climates. Basic sustainability says they shouldn't be there to begin with anyway, right? So the only populations you see are along the Nile, which of course has got the water. And you see population growth in North America also, places like Phoenix, Arizona, which by any measure simply should not exist. It has to grab resources from so far away, ordinary resources, simply to survive. So here's the thing. You have to recognize that different climates have different needs. Here's a very, very old-fashioned psychometric chart, and what I've plotted on here is the climates of various numbers of cities, and I put down an old-fashioned zone of indoor comfort. So you can see the effort it's going to take in different places to get that zone of indoor comfort. The only question, as Richard pointed out, is how do we intend to achieve it? So what are the consequences? Well, ubiquitously, these are the things that we associate with urban climates. Extreme micro-scale variation. Mostly associated with access to sunshine and with wind. Rainfall tends to be an obliterating factor. If you get a strong wind and rainfall, you won't see an urban effect. Not a strong urban effect, not on the thermal side. Enhanced heat stress, largely because of the type of materials we use. Profoundly modified hydrology. This is a river in Tokyo. Though I don't know why you'd even call it. It looks like a massive gutter. And of course, poor air quality. Probably the best known urban effect is what's known as the urban heat island. Now, the urban heat island tells you the difference between what's outside the city and what's inside the city. So don't see it as objective difference. You have to put it in its context. It was first discovered and measured in London by Luke Howard. Extraordinarily, this is almost 200 years ago when he did his basic research, and that's its plot. He was actually interested in the climate where London was located, and he was a bit annoyed to find out that the measurements which he had for London were what he regarded as a sort of contamination, that the local environment had actually raised the temperature. He identifies clearly when it occurs during the year, and he says something very, very cleverly, and it belongs in strictness to the nights. In other words, it's a nighttime phenomenon of the air temperature. It's a cooling problem, not a heating problem, from what he said. Now, since the advent of satellites, we can now look not only at the air temperature on the right-hand side for London, but also the surface temperature. Now, remember there's a satellite, so it looks down from above. It doesn't see too many vertical surfaces. But what you can clearly see on particularly the surface temperature map is vegetation cover versus impermeable surface is probably the strongest control on the strength of the daytime urban heat island, which is driven by heating from the sun, and then how it's disposed of at the surface. On the right-hand side, what we have is a cooling phenomenon, a nighttime phenomenon. It is the daytime and nighttime together that people are concerned about with regard to heat stress. Whatever about the local effects that cities have, part of the reason why they're part and parcel of global climate change research is because of the impact they have, not individually, but in aggregate on the global climate. And this is largely associated with their emissions. Now, there's a lot of arguments about this, but certainly the case that cities generate more than half of all the carbon dioxide emissions directly into the atmosphere. So if I want to solve global climate change, I need to focus on cities. There's no way around it. And cities in total probably only occupy about 3% of the land area of the world. In other words, our effort should be focused on managing the city. And here's the challenge, I think, is to manage the cities to address issues associated with global climate change, the famous zero carbon city, but also to manage the city in such a way that we actually want to live in those places. Cities are also tend to be in hazardous locations. They tend to choose places, obviously, next to rivers, close to coasts, often in places that are subject to extreme storms. If you were to pick out yourselves, probably the most hazardous cities on the planet, it would be places like Miami, which is practically at sea level. It sits right in the path of hurricanes. It's just a gamble as to whether a hurricane goes over there or not. Here's London, and of course, its famous barrier. The thing to remember, of course, this was not put in place to address climate change. This was put in place to address the climate London already has. The question now is how do we actually adjust it maybe for the climates of the future. This is what the IPCC reports say about what the likely impacts are going to be for cities. Warming, and then you have the urban heat island on top of it. More extreme, what they refer to as heat wave events. Now, heat wave events are natural phenomena. The question is about how often they occur and how severe they are. And the problem we have as humans is we have a great deal of difficulty in adjusting to sudden changes in warm temperatures. But I'd like to remind people that in this country and also my country, far more people die of cold than they ever die of heat. So you could make an argument, and Tony Chandler, who studied the urban heat island in London, made this in the past, that the urban heat island was probably one of the few benefits to come out of urbanisation, because it actually made wintertime temperatures slightly warmer. We expect more precipitation and more intense events because there's more energy in the system. And there's moderate confidence that will happen, which means that the hydrology affected. And the big change is instance and magnitude of extreme high level seas. And I think this is probably the one that's going to be the driving force behind changes with regard to adaptation for climate change, more so than, for example, the heating issue. So let me ask, what has urban climate science to offer? Now here's the thing, I think that urban climate science, in terms of the knowledge about how to change the system and all the rest, is probably in a fairly good state. The big collapse has been in what I think Michael Hebert has referred to before as a knowledge circulation failure. In fact, a lot of the knowledge we have is actually quite old, but it's just not being applied. So, do we have the science infrastructure? a notion about how to take measurements? Yes. Do we have an understanding of the framework in which it's placed? Yes, the models are getting better and better. Communication, I think, is really problematic, largely because it's a shared area. That the language that the building engineers use, for example, is not shared by the climate scientists. The language that the air quality people use is not shared by others. We have a big problem just having a common language to have a discussion, particularly because all decisions made about individual buildings have obvious impacts on what happens outdoors. We have certainly got examples of modifications, but we don't have a great deal of evaluation. Here's two famous examples. Chicago, since about 2005, has embarked on a big change to the urban-wide system to put reflective roofs in place and to put additional greening in place, whether it be on roofs or on the ground. There's been very few evaluations about its overall effectiveness. The satellite information suggests that, in fact, the albedo change is more cost-effective, but in the long term, that the vegetation is probably the better route to go, at least to complement it. The one below is the white roof scheme in New York. It's often put forward what they refer to as urban heat island mitigation, but both the examples I've chosen for you are adjustments made on top of 4, 5-story, 6-story buildings. Nobody lives there. We all live on the ground. It does not really impact on the climate you experience. The big effect of these interventions is largely for the building itself. Some people suggest that it's good for biodiversity. Frankly, unless the bird takes an elevator, I don't think that those types contribute a great deal to biodiversity. So what are the big drivers? Well, the one I think we often forget about is the sun. Especially in a climate like this, where it's often quite cloud covered, access to daylight and sunshine is often quite critical. It drives, obviously, the gathering of energy at the surface and the potential for warming. And you can see it clearly here in the picture from Berlin, which are taken with an infrared camera. You can see clearly where there's shadows and where there's light. It governs everything. Now here's the thing about your comfort for the human body point of view, is air temperature is just a small portion of how you feel comfortable. Your comfort is often derived not just from the air temperature, but from the temperatures of all the surfaces that surround you. So from the point of view of, say, microscale adjustment, a focus on the temperatures of the surfaces in places that you think are uncomfortable is a much better bet than focusing on the air temperature, which is much more difficult to change because air temperature, by its very nature, is integrative. It takes information from about a 1 kilometer area and it gives you an integrative value, whereas the temperature of a surface is fundamentally connected to its relationship to the sun. So here's the digital elevation model for London, for central London. The dark area you see at the bottom there is the river. And all I've done is taken a very simple piece of software to map out the shadow patterns at noon for the solar equinox, the solstice, excuse me, the equinox, and then, of course, December. Now you can see the implications for tall buildings in this environment, particularly during the winter months. They generate immense shadows. Knowledge sharing is good, but as I say, always go back to where the climate is. Access to sun, where I live, is considered a godsend. So there everybody is avoiding the shadows. Put me in a different climate, and now I want a different strategy. So people are now gathered in the shadows. People are making their own preferendums, choices, about where they feel most comfortable. This is one of my favorite examples. It was pointed out to me by Julie Fucher years ago. This is the Heron Tower back in the good old days when all of the photovoltaic cells had access to the sun. The thing is, it doesn't own the sun and doesn't own the resource. So next door to it, of course, is, I think it's called 101 Bishopsgate. You can see it on the right-hand side there, which basically blocks its entire access to the sun. So they managed to create now a dark corridor. The entire sheathing on this south-facing facade is rendered for naught. These are not new ideas. This is a beautiful book by William Atkinson on the orientation of buildings with regard to sunlight and with regard to ventilation. A lot of the book focuses on hospitals, but a great deal of it focuses on streets. So this is the shadow patterns he generated for streets in New York City at 40 degrees. Sorry, that's to tell me that I'm talking too long. Here's the other big thing that changes the microclimate, is the wind. And this is where decisions about how you orient buildings, where you place them, is absolutely critical. I think most of us know this diagram. It comes from a book by Paul Littlefair. These are utterly familiar, and yet I can find countless examples in this city that avoids every single one of those guidelines. In the upper left-hand corner, this is how Hong Kong hopes to deal with its ventilation problem. Put a hole in the building. In between is Calgary. They put up a series of tall buildings. It's bitterly cold. The tall buildings, of course, act like giant wind scoops to bring the winds, very cold and fast-moving winds, from above. So they built a whole series of metal trees to block it off. And there's the classic example of what happens when you get this type of building, which is that the air simply splits. One part shoots underneath the building in front, the other part shoots off in the other direction. And here's the Venturi effect that you can find quite easily in central London, where the two buildings are basically big flat-faced buildings, but they manage to leave a tiny space between the two for the air to squeeze in. The poor trees there seem to me to get replaced every time I come here. The trees are supposed to try and suddenly make the place better. Your ability to modify the climate depends entirely on the scale at which you operate. I think if there's one other thing apart from climate to recognise, the basic climate you get, is to recognise the influence of scale. At the individual building, at the neighbourhood, which I think is a critical scale, at the urban scale, and of course working all the way up to the scale of the planet itself. So how do you apply them? Well, first of all, I would say a big difference is whether you're already stuck with the place you have and you have to fix it. So remediation. First, where you're starting out from scratch, where you can put all the rules in place at the outset. A clear effort to try and link what you're trying to do to the outcome. Never neglect the importance of scale. One of the hardest things to do in climate science is to meet lots of goals simultaneously. I think part of our communication problems is that we're often too focused. I don't think it's just about sorting out the urban heat island problem. I think there's lots of issues that are important in the urban environment. The urban heat island issue is one of them. If you can fix that, also fix the issue of air quality, also fix the issue of thermal comfort, then you're onto something. But doing it all together is a challenge. I do think that urban design is critical. Not urban planning in terms of layout of things, but the actual design in terms of the form and the function of the place are critical. So here are fresh starts. Buildings are built so they all know at the outset no one's going to steal their sunlight. That's the whole basis on which these buildings are put in place. A building that's constructed to make use of access to sunshine with vegetation on one face. Or a beautiful example, an actual arcade, which I think are marvellous examples of allowing ventilation and also providing shade. This is what I call Walmart sustainability. It's a white roof building with solar voltaics on top. The building is sustainable. But look what it takes in the broader term to sustain it. First of all, it's out in the outskirts of Phoenix. It has an asphalt car park that's immense. And because of how they've designed it, of course, nobody has to walk more than, say, 50 yards to get into the shop. The result is, of course, you end up with an immense car park space, which has obliterated the natural environment. The building is sustainable, but nothing else is. I do think design is critical because it allows you to fix problems. And you've got lots of very, very good tools that can be used. I know that albedo will be discussed later. Ones I like are obviously water. Maybe less so in our climate, but in other climates, water is critical. I don't know if people have seen what happened in Paris this year in terms of how they adjusted to the extreme heat. It was providing lots and lots of water resources, some of which were microscale, simply little sprays of water, some of which were larger in terms of providing pools for people. I think vegetation is the most versatile tool of the lot. The ones I've shown here don't show facade vegetation or roof vegetation, which I think have a part to play, but I still think it's very, very hard to beat a tree in the ground that has connection to soil. I think you can never get all the soil properties and all the biodiversity associated with that simply by having a green facade. We have very, very few examples. I've got lots of microscale examples here. We have very few examples of planning at an urban scale. This is the one that everybody returns to. It's from Stuttgart in Germany. They've been doing this since the 1930s, largely to solve an air quality problem, but it's evolved over time to try and figure out the local landscape in which you're located, the climate in which you're located, and all design decisions are made within that framework. So they're constantly reviewing the system to see what's the best move forward. It involves land use management, involves building management, the whole suite, from urban scale down to the individual building scale. Now, if you don't mind, I'll just finish off with one thing to show you that I'm finished now in terms of that. I'm going to give you an example for Dublin. I'm going to do it at 2 scales. The first scale is the National Transport Authority decided they need to make the transport to Dublin more efficient. Now, Dublin is a little bit like London, much, much smaller, but a little like Dublin in the sense that about 25% of the entire population of the country live in and around the city. Most of them live outside the city boundaries and commute into the city centre. So it's a big congestion problem. Most of the jobs that people occupy in the city are located in the city centre, which you'll recognise is where all those systems converge. So the National Transport Authority decides to make the system more efficient. What they need to do is revisit all the transportation routes, make them wider, give separate bus corridors, separate cycle corridors, and separate car routes into the city to improve the efficiency of the city. And the argument made was clearly this would encourage people to get out of the cars into the bus and make the system more efficient. And lo and behold, that would reduce our carbon emissions. In order to do this, they had to basically strip away trees along every single one of those routes. I employed ARP to do the job, and ARP didn't even count the number of trees. So we always got vague estimates of how many trees they're going to cut down. So myself and a colleague simply counted the trees. So they were telling us it would be less than 1,000, but we estimated maybe up to 5,000 would be lost along all these various routes. Now, here is the problem. All the local communities claimed, of course, their trees were part of their climate change adaptation. They wanted the trees because they said, from an air quality point of view, from a noise quality point of view, and from an environmental point of view, the trees made sense. It made them want to go outdoors. So at a neighbourhood point of view, the trees were essential, but not from a climate change point of view, where the National Transport Authority decided the trees were expendable. A big fight ensued. Not surprising, you'll find out that some of those trees are located in some of the wealthiest suburbs in Dublin. So basically they tried to set up an argument to try and say that the wealthy people who had the trees shouldn't have those trees because you don't have them either. In other words, we should chop down these trees. Some of these trees were planted, by the way, before the formation of the state. They're hundreds of years old, 100 years old, and massive canopies. So you end up with a very strange situation where the communities argued that it was a community, a neighbourhood, not a corridor, and therefore they want to retain the trees. And the national organisation saying from a climate change point of view, this makes more sense. I think this is where the issue is going to rise with managing the climates in cities. It's going to be a battleground. And I do think what we're missing is not only the communication side of it, but we're missing is any regulatory environment in which to adjudicate between the different types of demands about climates in cities. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry I went over.